The star map filled the whole wall of the council chamber. It was wide and bright, and covered in colors: gold for Keth territory, blue for the Vorith Collective, red for the Sarathi Union, green for a dozen smaller species that had learned to stay small and quiet and alive. Every corner of the known galaxy labeled and claimed, and argued over. Centuries of war and trade and treaty pressed flat into light on a wall. In the center of all that color, gray. Just gray. No name, no border markings, no resource tag. A hole punched through the middle of the map that every civilization had agreed, without ever quite agreeing out loud, to leave exactly the way it was. Admiral Varric Solanae stood in front of it with his hands behind his back. He looked at the gray the way he looked at everything, like it was already his, and just hadn't been informed yet. He was tall, even by Keth standards. His uniform carried the weight of 40 years of campaigns on its shoulders and bore them without complaint. His record was the kind that got read aloud at military schools, edited slightly for clarity in the parts where things became difficult to explain, and handed down as proof that the Keth Empire expanded because it deserved to. He had never lost a war. Behind him, the high compact filled the tiered seats of the Chamber 37, of the most powerful political and military minds of the Keth Empire, arranged in a rough semicircle, all of them looking at the same gray nothing on the map. The Varith Corridor, Varric Solanae said, using the informal name that explorers had given to the hyperspace lanes running through the region. The most valuable transit route in this sector of the galaxy. Whoever controls the corridor controls movement between 11 inhabited systems. Trade, military logistics, communication relay. Everything flows through it or around it. He tapped the edge of the gray region. We have been moving around it for 60 years. That landed in the room the way he meant it to. Heavy, slightly embarrassing, like a grown adult, admitting they had been scared of a dark hallway in their own house. The resource surveys from the perimeter scans indicate mineral deposits and energy signatures consistent with Class 7 planetary clusters. He continued. Habitable worlds, possibly multiple. All of it sitting untouched inside a region that no active civilization currently claims. One of the compact members, a heavyset official named Sorath Vel, who oversaw trade expansion and had the permanently cautious expression of someone who had spent his life being blamed for things that weren't his fault, raised one hand. The treaty restrictions. There are no treaty restrictions, Varric Solanae said. There are informal agreements and shared nervousness. Those are not the same thing as law. Sorath Vel lowered his hand. The admiral turned back to the map. The gray region had an unofficial shape to it, wide at one end, narrowing toward the other, like something that had been poured and then left to set. In the briefing materials it was sometimes called the Pale, sometimes called the Silence. The cartographers who drew the original survey maps 200 years ago had labeled it with a single notation in the lower corner. Survey suspended. Reason. Crew consensus. Varric Solanae had read that notation 3 times before he accepted that it was the complete record. No further explanation, no incident report, just crew consensus. And then every ship that had been sent to map the region had quietly turned around and come back, and none of the crew members had been particularly eager to discuss their reasoning. He found it unimpressive. People talked themselves into cowardice every day of the galaxy's history. It was practically a tradition. We are proposing a formal annexation survey, he said. 6 ships of the line, 12 support vessels, a full scientific complement. We move through the corridor, we conduct the survey, we plant the markers. Standard procedure. The chamber murmured, not in opposition, in the soft, rolling way of people who were mostly convinced but wanted the record to show they had murmured, just in case. The doors of the chamber opened. Everyone turned. They came in without being announced. 7 of them, representing 7 different species, which was in itself unusual enough to stop conversation. Dead the Vorath, the Sarathi, the Pelin Combine, the Geth Reach, the 3 others whose names Varric Solanae had to check against the translator's reference file. All of them with different shapes and biologies, and histories. All of them wearing the same expression, give or take the relevant facial anatomy. The word the translator eventually produced was, do not. That was the expression. Every face, 7 different configurations of muscle and skin, and light-sensitive biology, all doing different physical things that the translator read as the same 2 words. Do not. The Vorath elder walked to the front of the group. She was old in the way that species who lived long lives became old, not frail, but compressed, like something that had been under pressure for a very long time and had simply become denser. Her name, as translated, was something close to Veneloth, though she had never corrected anyone who got it wrong because she had stopped expecting accuracy from younger species about 70 years ago. She did not ask permission to speak. She simply spoke. We are here to register a formal collective objection to the proposed survey of the Grey region. Her translator was better than the Keth standard. Her words came out clean. This objection is being made by 7 civilizations with a combined documented history of over 11,000 years of spaceflight. We make it with full awareness that it will likely be dismissed. That's a remarkably pessimistic opening, said Sorithvel. We have given this warning before, Veneloth said, to the Pelori Dominion, to the Cassian Republic, to the Breather Union, to others whose names your records may not carry because they no longer exist to be recorded. She paused. We made that mistake. The chamber was quiet. Varric Solen turned to face her properly. He gave her the full weight of his attention, which most beings found uncomfortable in some way they couldn't specifically name. You made the mistake of entering the region. We made the mistake of entering the region, she confirmed. And we made the second mistake of not believing the warning that was given to us before we did. 1. And who gave you that warning? The civilizations that went in before us, she said. The ones that came back. Some of them. The silence was longer this time. What is in the region? Varric Solene asked. His voice was the controlled kind, the kind that had learned not to show interest too openly. Veneloth looked at him steadily. Something that has been there for a very long time. Something that watches the border. Something that gives every fleet that enters exactly the same amount of time to change its mind. Something that, when the time expires and the fleet has not changed its mind, demonstrates, completely and without cruelty, why the warning existed. That is not a description, Varric Solane said. That is a story told to children. Yes, Veneloth agreed. It is. And children who listen to it stay alive. One of the compact members laughed. Not a mean laugh, the surprised kind. The kind that escapes before the brain can stop it. Then, a second member joined. Then the sound spread, warming the room, draining the tension from it the way a opened window drains smoke. Varric Solen did not laugh, but his expression did something adjacent to it, a slight relaxation at the corners of his mouth. The look of a man who has just had a worry, confirmed as silly. We appreciate the warning, he said. On behalf of the High Compact, we will ensure it is considered fully before any final decision is made. This was a diplomatic way of saying, we will set it aside within the hour. Veneloth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, not in agreement, but in the way of someone completing a ritual they already knew the outcome of. We will record our formal objection, she said, as we have recorded it before. For the archives, she paused. For whoever reviews those archives later. The delegation turned and walked out. All 7 of them. Same unhurried pace. Same way of moving, not defeated, not angry. Relieved. That was the word that surfaced in Thessaly, Eight's mind as she watched them go. She was standing against the far wall of the chamber in the position assigned to junior scouts during official briefings, present, visible, and functionally invisible to anyone who mattered. She had been cataloging the room's reactions during the Admiral's presentation, which was her job, and she was good at her job. The alien delegation did not look angry. They did not look frustrated. They looked like people who had driven a long way to try to stop a stranger from making a terrible decision, had made the attempt, and could now go home without guilt. They looked like people who had tried, and could now say, they tried. Thessaly, 8 watched Veneloth's back until the chamber doors closed. Then, she looked at the gray region on the map, which nobody was paying attention to anymore because the Admiral was already outlining departure timelines, and Sorithvel was already asking about insurance classifications for annexed resource territories. The gray region sat there on the wall, patient as always, waiting. Varric Solane was speaking about the efficiency of the corridor's hyperspace lanes, about transit times, about what it would mean for the Empire's expansion into the outer systems. He was good at this, at making the future sound inevitable, at making hesitation sound like a character defect. Superstition, he said, looking at the map. Is the tax cowards pay to stay comfortable? The chamber agreed. Not in words. In the sound of 37 people shifting slightly forward in their seats, leaning into the momentum of it. Thessaly, 8, wrote it down in her log. Filed it under the mission header. Attached it to the departure authorization forms that would go out by morning. Then she looked at the gray region one more time. She could not have said why she looked. There was nothing to see. It was just gray. Just empty space on a colored map, surrounded by everyone else's ambitions and histories. But standing in that room, listening to the Admiral talk about what was theirs to take, she felt not fear, exactly. Not anything she had a good word for. The feeling of a door she could not see but knew was somewhere close. The feeling of something on the other side of it that had heard them knocking, that had been expecting them. She closed her log, straightened her uniform, prepared for deployment. Outside the chamber, the 7 alien delegates were already gone, walked out into the corridor, and disappeared back to their ships, back to their own councils, back to the records they kept of all the times they had stood in rooms, exactly like this one, and said exactly these words, and watched exactly this sequence of events unfold. The Vorith Elder, moving through the long corridor toward the docking bay, said nothing to her companions. There was nothing to say. There never was, at this point. She had done what could be done. The record showed it. The archive held it. And in a few months, when the Keth Empire's fleet came back, some of it, whatever the humans decided to send back the record, would be reviewed by whoever was left to review it, and the warning would be updated, and the next civilization that got ambitious about the gray region would receive the same delegation and the same words, and would, in all likelihood, make the same decision, because the warning never said enough to stop the kind of people who needed stopping. That was the thing about warnings. They only worked on the people who would have listened anyway. The first 3 days were perfect. That was the problem. That was the thing Thessaly, 8, kept returning to later, when she had time to think about it, how clean everything was, how cooperative the sensors were, how the stars sat exactly where the charts said they would sit, and the hyperspace lanes ran smooth, and the readings came back normal on every sweep. And nothing happened. Nothing at all. 18 warships of the Keth Empire slid into the gray region on a Tuesday morning by Compact Standard Time, and the gray region received them without comment. No interference. No signal. No unidentified contacts. Just space wide and dark and still. The crew of the survey flagship Keth Dominant celebrated the clean entry with a meal that was slightly better than the standard rations. Admiral Varric Solen filed the first mission log, noted the absence of any resistance or anomaly, and described the alien delegation's warning as consistent with interspecies superstition, motivated by resource protectionism. Thessaly, 8, ate her meal at the junior officer's table and said nothing. She watched the stars outside the viewport and thought about the word times nothing. Nothing was not a neutral thing. Nothing was a choice. Nothing was what you got when something had decided not to act yet. She filed this thought under Time's personal observations, non-essential times, and went back to her readings. On day 4, they found the first debris field. It was not large. A cluster of broken hull sections and dead machinery spread across a volume of space roughly the size of a small moon's orbit. The metals were corroded in the way of very old things, not by atmosphere, since there was no atmosphere, but by time and radiation, and the slow, patient work of the vacuum on everything that wasn't maintained. The survey team cataloged it automatically. Debris fields were common enough near transit lanes. Accidents happened. Ships failed. Thessaly, 8, added her own notation to the standard entry. Hull, configuration, non-standard running identification query. The identification query came back in 40 minutes. She read the result 3 times. Then she walked to the nearest porthole and looked at the debris and thought about what 40 minutes of processing time meant. It meant the computer had looked through every registered hull design in the Keth database, every allied species database, every historical record it had access to, and had come up with 14 of the 17 distinct hull configurations in the field were times unregistered, not from a species the Keth didn't have relations with, not from a civilization that was obscure or distant, unregistered, as in, the civilization that built those ships was not in any current database because there was no current civilization left to put it there. The other 3 she recognized. She recognized them because she had studied expansion history at the military academy, and expansion history included the cautionary chapters, the ones about empires that had grown fast and then stopped. The Pelori Dominion, gone 80 years ago, cause listed as time's internal collapse. The Cassian Republic, dissolved 140 years back. Records incomplete. The Breather Union, 110 years before that. Last entry in the historical record, describing a fleet deployment that the next entry never mentioned again. All three of those civilizations had disappeared within a generation of their last known military expansion. She looked at their broken ships floating in the dark. She wrote up a full report, marked it priority, attached the identification data, sent it up the command chain to her supervising officer, Commander Fetch-Valen, who was responsible for scientific cataloging on the survey mission. Fetch-Valen marked it times noted, did not reply further. Thessaly, 8, went back to her station and looked at her screens. On day 6, the second debris field appeared, then the third. Then, by day 8, they had cataloged 11 of them, scattered across the region like breadcrumbs dropped by someone walking a very long, very old path. Each one, a cluster of dead ships. Each one a mix of registered and unregistered hull types. Each one sitting at an interval from the others that was, she realized, not random. She ran the spacing through a basic geometric analysis, because she had learned at the academy to run everything through basic geometric analysis when the pattern felt wrong. The fields were positioned at exact intervals, consistent distance, consistent angle relative to the region's center, consistent height relative to the galactic plane. Like markers, like someone had placed them there. Not as a warning, the galaxy was full of warning beacons, and this wasn't that. These weren't broadcasting, they weren't lit, they were just sitting, dark and still, in a pattern that was too precise to be coincidence, and too old to be recent. She filed a second report, more detailed, included the geometric analysis, added a note at the bottom that said, "These debris fields may not be the result of accidents. Recommend full structural analysis of field positioning before mission continues." Fetch-Valen marked it times noted. She did not hear back. On day 9, the signal arrived. It came through on a standard broadcast frequency, the kind used for civilian communications. Not military, not scientific. Open and clear and completely unencrypted. Which meant, whoever was sending it wasn't worried about anyone listening. The signal was a weather report. Thessaly, 8 stared at her screen for a full minute, trying to decide if the translation was correct. It was. A detailed, competent, thoroughly ordinary weather report, predicting atmospheric conditions on a planet that appeared on the survey maps as a small, rocky world 3 days ahead of their current position. Temperature gradients, storm patterns, seasonal wind cycles. It was not the content that made her sit very still in her chair. It was the language. She ran it through 3 separate translation matrices, because the first result seemed wrong, and the second confirmed the first, and she ran the third to make sure she wasn't somehow making an error in her reading of the output. She was not making an error. The language was human, a specific dialect of a human regional language, the kind spoken in a particular cluster of settlements that the Keth Diplomatic Archive described in the past tense. The way you described a place that no longer existed. The archive entry was thorough. Species biology, cultural notes, technological level at last contact, diplomatic status times neutral, limited engagement times, and at the top of the entry, in the category for current status, species, human, status, extinct, presumed, last confirmed contact, 3-1-0 years, prior. She read the word times, presumed times 5 times. It sat there on the screen looking very small and very important. 310 years. The Keth Empire had last made contact with a human settlement 3 centuries ago. The settlement had been small, isolated. The diplomatic files showed 2 formal exchanges. 1, trade negotiation that stalled, and then silence. The Keth had assumed the settlement had failed, resources depleted, colony ship lost, biological crisis. Any of the 100 ways a small, isolated outpost could quietly stop existing. Presumed extinct. Not confirmed. She pulled up every human reference file in the archive. There weren't many. Humans had been a footnote in Keth diplomatic history, a minor species, limited numbers, single known settlement cluster, no significant political or military presence. They had simply been there and then stopped being there, which was not uncommon. The galaxy was full of species that had tried spaceflight, settled a few worlds, and then encountered the 100 difficulties of survival at scale, and quietly disappeared. The archive listed 6 other civilizations that had gone the same way in the same time period. It was not considered remarkable. What was remarkable was a weather report in a dead language, broadcasting live predictions about a planet 3 days ahead of them. Predictions that, when Thessaly 8 cross-referenced them against the survey team's own atmospheric readings, collected at long range, were exactly right. Current as of this morning. Someone was watching that planet's weather right now. She stood up, walked down the corridor to the command deck, knocked on the frame of the Admiral's situation room. Varric Solane was reviewing the mission timeline with 2 of his senior commanders. He looked at her the way he looked at all junior officers who interrupted his planning sessions with the focused patience of a man who was about to say something very precise about the appropriate chain of command. She handed him the report. Both of them. The debris analysis and the signal. He read them. He was a thorough reader. She could see him processing the data, checking the translation reference, looking at the geometric analysis of the debris positions. He looked at the word times, presumed times, for about 3 seconds. Then he put the reports on the table, looked at the mission timeline. Continue the survey, he said. Sir, the debris fields are consistent with historical fleet losses in a high-risk transit zone, he said. Other civilizations failed to navigate this region. That is a navigation problem. We have better charts than any of them did. He picked up his stylus. The signal is either a historical broadcast still running on automatic, or it is a live signal from a small remnant population that survived in isolation. Neither scenario changes our mission parameters. If it's live, then we will make contact when we arrive, he said. That is how contact works, Lieutenant. You arrive, and then you make it. He went back to the timeline. She stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than she meant it to. Then she walked back to her station, sat down, and looked at her screen. The signal was still playing. The weather report cycling through its data: temperatures, winds, projected precipitation over the next 7 days. Calm, competent, unworried. 310 years. She pulled up the debris field positions on the map and looked at them together. 14 destroyed civilizations worth of ships, positioned at exact intervals, like measurements on a ruler, and in the direction they pointed, at the end of the ruler's length, a planet, broadcasting weather, in a language that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, presumed extinct. She looked at the signal. She looked at the debris. She thought about what kind of species spent 300 years going extinct and still found time to predict the weather. She thought about the alien delegates walking out of the council chamber, the way Veneloth had moved, not angry, not sad, the expression of someone completing a ritual they already knew the ending of. We have given this warning before. Thessaly 8 looked at the debris fields on her screen, 11 of them, old as history, placed like mile markers leading toward a center that was now 3 days ahead of them. She understood, somewhere below the level of words, that the markers were not left by accident, that they were not wreckage, that every piece of every dead ship in every field had been put there by someone who was very good at putting things where they needed to be, and then waiting. She filed her reports. She logged her concerns. She did what a good officer did. She watched the signal play, the weather report, calm, current, precise. The voice on the signal was unhurried. The voice of someone who had nowhere pressing to be. The voice of someone who had been doing the same job for a very long time and had found a kind of peace in it. 3 days ahead, whatever was there had been watching the border since before the Keth Empire had known the region existed, had watched empire after empire stand at the edge of the map and squint into the dark and make its decision, had watched them all come in, had let the fleet settle into its course. The weather report played on. 3 days. The planet was alive, not barely alive, not clinging to survival in the way of small isolated colonies rationing power, recycling everything 3 times, watching population numbers with the careful attention of people who knew the math didn't favor them, alive in the way of a civilization that had been doing this long enough to be comfortable with it. Infrastructure that went down more than it went up. buildings carved into rock instead of raised above it, tunnels and chambers and networks of buried structures spreading through the crust of the planet, like the root system of something very old and very patient. From orbit, the surface looked quiet, almost empty. The survey team's deep scanners told a different story. Thessaly. 8 watched the readout build in real time as the fleet's instruments found layer after layer of it. Power signatures a kilometer down, then 2, then 5, then deeper still. Thermal readings consistent with large-scale manufacturing. Atmospheric processors running on a cycle that kept the surface breathable and the climate managed, and the storm patterns exactly where the weather report had predicted they would be. There were 3 moons. All 3 had been modified. Not recently. The surface alterations on the oldest of them dated back 260 years by the geological analysis. Habitation domes, collapsed or removed, but the tunnels underneath them still pressurized, still lit, still carrying the small, steady heat signature of machinery that had been running for 3 generations without stopping. Commander Fetchvalen, looking at the same data, called it time's primitive bunker mentality. Said it was consistent with a population that had experienced some kind of traumatic event early in their history and had never psychologically recovered from the defensive crouch. Said it in the tone of someone describing a species that had made a reasonable choice given limited options, but shouldn't be expected to understand more sophisticated approaches to civilization building. Thessaly. 8. Looked at the moon tunnels and thought about what it took to carve pressurized tunnels through rock 260 years ago and keep them running continuously since. She wrote, "Infrastructure suggests long-term strategic intent, not emergency response." Filed it. Received no response. At 0600 on the 3rd day, Commander Dara Osei Mwangi made contact. She didn't appear on screen with any ceremony. The transmission opened, and she was simply there, sitting slightly sideways in what looked like a working chair. Not a formal one. She was holding something she was eating, and she did not stop eating it when the connection established. She was a compact person, brown-skinned, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned that staying calm was not a personality trait, but a survival skill. She looked at the Keth communication officer who had received the signal, then passed him at whoever else was in the room. "Who's in charge?" she said. Admiral Varric Solan stepped into the frame. She looked at him the way you looked at someone you had been expecting, the way a shopkeeper looks at a customer who has walked into the store every day for a month without buying anything and has finally picked something up and brought it to the counter. "Admiral," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was just the word, placed in the sentence where a greeting would go. "Commander." He matched her tone without meaning to. "I am Admiral Varric Solan, of the Keth Imperial Survey Fleet. We are conducting a resource survey of this region, under authority of the High Compact." "I know," she said. He paused. "You know. You're not the first," she said. "You won't be the last, probably." She finished what she was eating. "You got the warning, right?" "The delegation. 7 species, old Vorath elder, very serious. We received a warning. Yes. And you came anyway. We found the warning unpersuasive," he said. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone hearing a sentence they have heard before and finding it no more surprising the 15th time than the first. "Yeah," she said. "They always do." The word they times occupied the room. They, not you. They, as in a category, as in a pattern that had repeated enough times to need a pronoun that was broader than any single fleet. Varric Solan did not acknowledge the word. He was too experienced a diplomat to show that a pronoun had landed. "We would like to discuss the terms of this region's formal incorporation into the Keth Empire," he said. "Standard annexation protocols allow for transition periods, partial autonomy arrangements, and resource sharing agreements that benefit both." "How many ships did you bring?" she asked. He told her. She looked at something off screen for a moment, then back. "Okay. Here's what I'm going to do." She settled slightly in her chair, not threatening, the way a person settles when they're about to explain something that should be obvious. "I'm going to give you 48 hours to turn your fleet around and leave. Take your ships, take your crew, go back to wherever the compact is, and update your maps. Mark this region as occupied. Name it whatever you like. We've been calling it the Patience, but you can call it something else if you want." Varric Solan looked at her for a moment. "And if we don't?" Then at the end of 48 hours, you'll find out why every other fleet that entered this region either left or didn't come back. She said it the way a mechanic tells you your brakes are going to fail. Not angry, not threatening, just the flat transfer of accurate information from someone who knows the machinery to someone who doesn't. Varric Solain glanced at the officers around him. The glance that meant, "Are you seeing this?" What he saw in her, Thessaly, 8 knew, was weakness. A small population in a buried civilization with no visible fleet, no weapons platforms in orbit, no military ships on the scanners. One woman on a working chair eating a meal and giving him a deadline like she was the one with 18 warships. He saw weakness. He saw bluff. He saw a species that had been hiding underground for 300 years and had confused its own survival for power. "Commander," he said, and his voice was the careful kind, the voice he used when he was being generous to an opponent who didn't fully understand their position. "I appreciate the spirit of your offer, but I want to be direct with you. The Keth Empire has established protocols for exactly this kind of situation. We are prepared to be reasonable. We would prefer a cooperative arrangement to a difficult one, but the survey will continue. That is not a negotiating position. That is the mission." 2. She looked at him. Something in her face did a very small thing. Not anger, not fear. The thing a face does when it has processed a piece of information it already had but wanted to hope was wrong. "For the record," she said, "we gave you the same chance we gave all of them." The transmission closed. The phrase sat in the room the way heavy objects sit, taking up more space than their size suggested. All of them. Varric Solain turned back to his command crew and began outlining the next phase of the survey. Resource teams. Landing protocols. The ordered, professional machinery of an empire that had done this before moving into its next operation. Thessaly, 8, sat at her station and looked at the closed transmission screen. All of them. She pulled up the debris field data again. The 11 fields, scattered across the region. The 14 unregistered hull types. The 3 dead empires whose last known action had been sending a fleet in this direction. She pulled up the historical record on humans, the full file, not the summary. Read it straight through. A species that had originated on a single planet, developed spaceflight, established a small cluster of settlements, then gone quiet. The last formal Keth contact 310 years ago. A colony outpost, modest in size, neutral in its diplomatic posture. She looked at the planet below, the tunnels in the moons, the buried infrastructure. She thought about what you built in 300 years if you decided not to expand outward, if you decided to go down instead of out, if you turned all the energy and time and material that other civilizations spent on ships and territories and wars inward, into rock, into depth. If you spent 3 centuries building something that nobody could see from the outside, in a region that every other civilization had learned not to enter, what would you have at the end of 300 years? She thought about the debris fields, the way they were placed. She thought about Vanelloth's face, times relieved times when the warning was rejected. She thought about Commander Ose Mwangi, eating her meal, not stopping when the connection opened. The absolute absence of urgency in the way she had delivered the deadline. The same way a person gives an expiration date on a medicine not because they want you to be sick, but because that is simply when the thing stops working. 48 hours. Thessaly, 8, opened a new personal log entry. She did not file it in the mission record. She wrote it because she needed somewhere to put the thought, and her head was getting crowded. She wrote, Ose Mwangi said, all of them. This implies she has spoken to other fleets in this position. This implies either this is not the first contact she has personally conducted, or she has access to the record of previous contacts conducted by others. Either way, there is a record. They have been doing this for long enough to have a record. She looked at what she had written. She added, a species does not develop a documented protocol for receiving invasion fleets unless they have received enough invasion fleets to need one. She closed the log. On the command deck, Admiral Varric Solain was explaining to his senior officers why the 48-hour deadline was not a military threat, but a psychological posturing move by a population that had no real leverage. He was thorough and logical and correct by every military framework he had available to him. He was correct the way a man is correct when he has all the right information and has assessed it against all the wrong context. In 47 hours and 51 minutes, the deadline would expire. Thessaly, 8, looked at the planet. at the tunnels, at 300 years of building that faced inward instead of out. She thought, you only build inward if you have already decided you don't need to go outward. You only build inward if you have already made your walls so deep that outward doesn't matter anymore. If your defense doesn't sit on the surface where fleets can find it and fight it and defeat it, but runs through the bones of every rock and moon in the system, invisible, patient, 300 years deep. She thought, the 48 hours is not a deadline for them. It is a courtesy for us. Outside the viewport, the planet turned slowly in the dark. The surface quiet. The moon still. 300 years of work underneath every square kilometer of stone and ice in silence. The weather report played on the open channel, predicting tomorrow's conditions. It had been right every time. The 48 hours passed without drama. No buildup, no warning signal, no visible change in the planet below or the space around the fleet. The deadline expired, the way a clock reaches midnight not with a sound, but with the simple fact of one number becoming another. At 0001 on the second day, Commander Dara Ose Mwangi did not transmit. There was no second message, no final warning. The channel that had carried her voice stayed silent, and stayed that way. Admiral Varric Solen ordered the survey to proceed. The first thing that happened was the routes stopped working. Not the ships, not the weapon systems or the engines or the life support, just the navigation. The hyperspace corridor they had entered through the one that was supposed to run clean and clear all the way back to compact space returned a path error when the fleet's navigators ran the calculation. The calculation that should have produced a 3-day transit back to the border instead produced a set of coordinates that didn't match anything in the charts. The navigators ran it again. Different result. Same problem. Not wrong in a consistent way. Wrong in the way of a map that someone had altered while you weren't watching. They ran it 7 times. 7 different results. None of them matched the route they had come in on. The route they had come in on no longer existed. It had not been jammed. Jamming would have shown up on sensors as interference, as a signal source, as something to locate and target. This was cleaner than jamming. The route simply was not there anymore. The corridor they had sailed through for 3 days had been, quietly, while they were busy looking at the planet, rewritten in 48 hours. Varric Solen stood at the navigation console looking at this for approximately 90 seconds before issuing orders for the fleet to close formation and go to combat readiness. The fleet closed. The weapons came up. Every scanner turned outward, watching for the approaching force that was about to make itself known. Nothing approached. The space around the fleet was empty in every direction. Stars, dark. The planet below, still quiet. The moons, still. Then the first asteroid moved. It was not a small asteroid. It was roughly 4 kilometers at its widest, which put it in the category of objects that other objects get out of the way of, not the category of objects you intercept. It had been sitting in a slow orbital path at the edge of the system, catalogued on day 1 of the survey as a natural feature, unremarkable. It moved like something with a purpose, not fast, not faster than it needed to be. A steady, committed arc that placed it precisely in the gap between 2 of the fleet's destroyer-class ships. When Thessaly, 8th scanner resolved it at close range, she saw what the Day 1 survey hadn't shown. The interior of it had been hollowed and rebuilt. Engines retrofitted into the rock itself, not recent work. The construction signatures were old, decades old, which meant the asteroid had been sitting in that orbital path for 30 or 40 years, waiting. Engines cold, indistinguishable from natural rock, waiting for a fleet. The destroyers opened fire on it. Of course they did. Their weapons were good. The Keth military built effective ships and trained effective crews, and they hit it squarely and repeatedly. And they damaged it. And it kept coming, because 4 kilometers of rock absorbs a great deal of damage before it stops being 4 kilometers of rock. The asteroid passed between the 2 destroyers. They moved to avoid the collision. The maneuver took them out of formation. The second asteroid was already moving by then. Thessaly, 8, watched her scanner board and felt the pattern before she could name it. She had an analyst's instinct, the product of 3 years of training that taught her to look at the shape of things rather than the pieces. She saw the 2 destroyers pulled out of position. She saw the gap that created in the fleet's formation. She saw the gap fill, almost immediately, with 3 smaller contacts, not asteroids, ships, old ones, Keth built from the look of the hull signature, centuries-old design pulled from the debris fields and reactivated and crewed by nothing at all. Running on automation, used as kinetic rams aimed at the fleet's flanks. Their own predecessors' ships, turned around and sent back. She watched the fleet fight. She watched it fight hard and with real skill. Varric Solan was a good admiral. His crew responded quickly and coordinated well and adapted to each new contact faster than they had adapted to the last. For the first hour they held their ground. For the second hour they held something adjacent to it. They were not being destroyed. That was what she noticed by hour 3. That was the thing that sat wrong in her chest. The observation that pushed through everything else and demanded attention. They were not being destroyed. Ships were being hit. Systems damaged. 2 frigates had taken heavy fire and pulled back from their positions. But the fleet's core, the flagship and the heavy cruisers and the troop carriers was intact. The attacks were precise, and they were sustained, and they were not lethal to what mattered. She looked at the pattern of the attack again, watched the way each strike fell, the way the asteroids moved, and where they moved, and the gaps they created, and where those gaps led. The fleet was being pushed, slowly, systematically, sorted. The word came to her the way words came when the brain had been working on a problem for longer than you realized. The attacks were not designed to destroy the fleet. They were designed to move it, to push some ships toward certain vectors while keeping others in place, to separate the fleet into groups, not by force, but by the architecture of the attack, by making certain directions dangerous and certain directions not. She ran the vectors on her screen, drew the lines, looked at where each group of ships was being nudged toward. Some of them were being guided toward dead ends, zones where the asteroid swarm was thickest, where the old ghost ships were running in concentrated formation, where there was no clean exit. The others, fewer ships, scattered across the fleet. No particular pattern she could identify by class or armament, were being guided toward gaps in the assault. Clear corridors through the chaos. Routes that weren't being hit. Routes that had been left open. She looked at her own ship's position on the fleet map. Her ship was in the second group. She sat with that for a moment that stretched out longer than moments usually stretched. Then she understood. Not all of it, but enough. The fleet was not being fought. It was being times processed. The humans had done this before. The debris field said they had done this before, 17 times at minimum, and they had learned from each one, had refined the system, had figured out which ships to keep and which to send back and how to separate them from each other without the kept ones being able to help the sent back ones. They were choosing the messengers. They were choosing which ships would leave here and which would not, and they were making that choice based on something she could not fully read, and they were executing it with the mechanical certainty of a process that had been calibrated across centuries. She was a messenger. She had been chosen. She did not know why, and she did not have time to figure it out, because her ship's pilot was already reading the gaps in the attack pattern and instinctively moving toward them, and she could either stop him or she could let him do what the humans had already designed this whole engagement to make him do. She let him do it. On the command deck, Admiral Varric Solan had stopped issuing tactical orders. He was still standing. He was looking at the battle display with his hands at his sides and his face doing something it had never done before in 40 years of campaigns. Understanding. Not of the tactics. He had understood the tactics an hour ago, understood them well enough to know that his counters were working exactly as well as the humans wanted them to work, which was not well enough. He was understanding something larger, the thing that the debris fields had been pointing at, and that he had labeled times, navigational failures, by less advanced civilizations. This had not been built for him. This had been built for whoever came. It had been built to work against Keth tactical doctrine and Pelori tactical doctrine, and Cassian tactical doctrine, and every other doctrine from every other fleet that had made this trip, because it had been tested against all of them, and refined accordingly. He was not fighting a defense that had been built for his fleet. He was fighting a defense that had been built from his fleet's predecessors. He sent one last communication to High Compact. 3 sentences. The transmission was cut before he could finish the 4th. Not by the humans, by the damage to his communications array from a strike he hadn't seen coming because he had been looking at the wrong part of the display. Thessaly, 8, did not hear what the 3 sentences were. She heard, from across the command deck, the sharp silence that followed a cut transmission. She heard her pilot say they were clear of the engagement zone. She looked at the scanner board and saw that 11 ships had made it through the gaps. 11 of 18. She looked at what was happening behind them at the 7 ships that had not made it through. They were not destroyed. Not yet. They were contained. Held inside the asteroid formation like something cupped in a hand, still fighting, their weapons still working, their crews still alive. Still alive. The humans could have killed them. At multiple points in the last 5 hours, she had seen angles of attack that could have been lethal, and had been, instead, something less than lethal. Something precisely calibrated to damage without killing. They were keeping them. She didn't know what for. She didn't let herself finish the thought. Her ship passed through the last gap in the asteroid formation and came out into clear space, and the gap closed behind them, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow certainty of something that had been set in motion a long time ago and was now completing its arc. 11 ships, running along vectors the humans had decided, sometime in the last 48 hours, to leave open for exactly this purpose. The weather report played on the open channel. Still calm. Tomorrow's forecast. Thessaly. 8 looked back at the system they were leaving behind. The planet, turning. The moons, patient. The asteroid formation, resettling into its long orbit like an animal returning to rest. 300 years of building that went inward instead of out. She understood now what you had. At the end of 300 years, if you built inward, you had a trap with no walls you could see, no weapons you could target, and no end until the people inside it decided there was an end. You had something that knew exactly how you fought before you arrived, because it had fought everyone who came before you and taken notes. You had the patience. The name fit. She set course for the border and did not look back. Behind her, somewhere in the rock and the dark and the 300-year deep infrastructure, Commander Dara Ose Mwangi was probably eating something and watching the fleet's departure on a screen somewhere and feeling, if Thessaly, 8, had to guess, nothing more dramatic than the quiet satisfaction of a job that was not finished, but was proceeding exactly as planned. 11 ships going home, carrying the message, exactly as planned. The debrief lasted 6 hours. Thessaly, 8, had never spoken in front of the High Compact before. She had stood in that chamber once, when she was first commissioned, with 40 other junior officers in a row, and received her assignment tablet without looking up. That was the extent of her experience in the room where the most powerful people in the Keth Empire made their decisions. She looked up now. 31 of the 37 seats were filled. 6 members were absent, 3 because they were coordinating with border stations, 2 because they were managing the public response to the fleet's return, and 1 because he had taken the news badly enough that his physician had suggested rest, and the compact had agreed. She told them everything, from the debris fields on day 4, to the geometric positioning, to the signal in a dead language, to the 48 hours, to the way the asteroid formation had moved, and what it had moved like, and the patterns she had seen in the sorting of the fleet. She told them about the hull configurations she had recognized, the Pelori Dominion, the Cassian Republic, the Breather Union. She showed them the identification data, the distance calculations, the timeline she had reconstructed by cross-referencing the dates of each empire's disappearance from the historical record against the estimated age of their ships in the debris fields. She put it on the chamber's display where the star map had been, the gray region in the center, now with the debris fields plotted on it, now with the entry and exit vectors of the fleet mapped in, now with the position of the planet and the moons, and the movement of the asteroids drawn as lines across the display. She pointed at the timeline on the right side of the display. 300 years. Each event marked. Each fleet that had entered. Each group of ships that had come back out. Each empire whose last logged action was a survey or annexation attempt pointed toward the gray region. The chamber was silent for a long time after she finished. The first speaker, an older official named Cassian Vol, who had been on the compact for 20 years and had voted in favor of the mission, looked at the timeline for a while before speaking. "You believe this to be deliberate," he said. "Not defense. A system." "Yes," Thessaly Noltz said. "A system developed over 3 centuries. At minimum," she said. "To what end?" She had thought about this for the entire journey home. For 3 days of hyperspace transit, sitting at her station when she could have been sleeping, looking at the data and building the answer piece by piece. "The debris fields are placed at exact intervals," she said. Every fleet that enters the region encounters them. Some navigate past. Most keep going. The ones that reach the planet are given 48 hours and then engaged. The engagement is designed to let some ships go. Those ships come home. They tell this story. She paused. To the next empire that's considering whether to enter the region. The chamber heard this. The debris fields are not wreckage, she said. They're the warning. The actual warning. Not the words the alien delegates said. Those were never going to work. And the humans probably knew that. The debris is the warning. Every destroyed ship from every civilization that went in before us, those are the words. Placed where we would find them. Spaced where we would have to look at them long enough to count them. Another long silence. And we counted them, said Cassian Vol. We counted them, she confirmed. He sat back in his chair. The expression on his face was the one people got when they had been holding a thing they thought was heavy, and had just been shown what heavy actually looked like. Why? The chamber doors opened. The 7 delegates came in again. Same 7 species. Same arrangement. Venoloth in front. Moving with the compressed patience of someone who had made a very long journey many times, and had long stopped noticing the distance. They had not been invited. They had arrived, because they always arrived at this point. Because this point always came. The Compact's first speaker looked at them. You knew, he said, not accusatory. The flat, tired acknowledgement of someone who had recently run out of energy for pretense. We were told, Venoloth said, by the fleets that came before ours, who had been told by the fleets before theirs. She moved to the center of the chamber without being directed to it. We were where you are, once. We sat in a room like this one with a timeline like that one on the wall. She looked at the display. Ours had fewer entries. What did they do? Said Cassian Vol. With the 7 ships we left behind. The same thing they do with all of them. Venoloth said. They are held. They are not harmed. If the crew does not force the issue. Eventually they are released. When the humans decide the lesson has had time to settle. Settle with whom? With the empire that sent them. She looked at the timeline. The humans are not interested in war. They are not interested in territory. They are not interested in an empire of their own. They have had one. She paused. They do not want another. The chamber was very quiet. What they want, Venoloth continued, is to be left alone. That is all they have wanted for 300 years. They built everything you saw, the tunnels, the systems, the asteroids, all of it not to expand, but to make the cost of disturbing them so clear and so consistent and so well documented that eventually the galaxy would stop trying. Is it working? Asked the first speaker. Venoloth looked at him steadily. You are the 17th Empire to send a fleet into the Patience. You are the 17th Empire to receive the 48-hour warning. You are the 17th to refuse it. She paused. None of the previous 16 have sent a second fleet. The room absorbed this. None of the previous 16. 17 civilizations. Each one certain that they were different. Each one looking at the warning and seeing weakness, or superstition, or bluff. Each one sending a fleet in and receiving some ships back and sitting in a chamber like this one, looking at a timeline like that one, doing the math they should have done before they left. The transmission arrived while the chamber was still processing this. It came through the official diplomatic channel, clearly sent, unencrypted. The communications officer relayed it to the chamber display without comment. Commander Dara Ose Mwangi, sitting in the same chair as before, the same quality of stillness. She looked directly at whatever was recording her, and spoke with the straightforwardness of someone who had made this transmission before, and had long since found the exact words for it. Update your maps, she said. The gray region has a name. It's called the Patience. You're welcome to visit. We have no objection to traders, researchers, or anyone else coming through in small numbers. We'll establish a proper contact protocol if you want one. But come with military intent and we'll finish what we started. She paused. The pause had nothing in it, no threat, no drama, just the beat of a person checking that their meaning was clear. We'll release your 7 ships when our analysts have finished the review. Probably 3 months. Your crews are fine. Another pause. You're welcome to send the warning on to whoever comes next. That's the whole point. The transmission ended. The chamber sat with it. You're welcome to send the warning on. That's the whole point. Not a threat. An instruction. The humans did not want the warning kept quiet, they wanted it spread. accurately, with all the detail and all the data, to every civilization, in every direction. They wanted the 17th Empire to tell the 18th. They wanted the story told correctly so that eventually, maybe, the number of fleets that needed to learn this lesson the hard way would get smaller. The warning was not about the humans. The warning was the entire system. The debris fields and the dead ships and the 48 hours and the sorted fleet, and the ships sent home. All of it was the warning. The alien delegates had never been the point. They were the cover page. The actual document was the gray region itself. 300 years of accumulated evidence arranged in a shape that said, "This has happened before, and here is how it ended. And here is your chance to make a different choice." Thessaly, 8 stood at the front of the chamber and looked at the timeline on the wall. 17 entries, 17 fleets, 17 groups of ships sent home with the message. None of the previous 16 had sent a second fleet. The system worked. Not quickly, not in the way of a decisive battle or a signed treaty, but over time, in the way that geology works, and weather works, and anything works, that is given enough time and patience to let cause produce effect without forcing it. She thought about the word times, presumed times in the human archive entry. The Keth database had looked at 300 years of silence from a small colony cluster and presumed extinction, had filed it away, had moved on. The humans had not presumed anything. They had been building. She thought about Ose Mwangi eating her meal when the transmission opened, not stopping, not performing calm times, having times it, the way you had a thing that you had carried for so long it had become part of the furniture of your life. 300 years of this. Not 300 years for Ose Mwangi specifically. She was one generation of a long line of people who had grown up in the tunnels and learned the protocols and taken up the watch when the previous generation put it down. 300 years of being the species that the galaxy decided didn't need worrying about. 300 years of using that decision. Later that evening, after the chamber had dissolved into smaller meetings and the business of managing the political fallout had begun its slow grind, Thessaly, 8, walked to a corridor window on the building's upper floor. The kind of window that faced out toward the sky, toward the part of the sky that contained, too far away to be visible, the gray region on the map, which was not gray anymore. Somebody had already updated the display. She had seen it on her way out of the chamber. The region on the wall map now had a label in the center of it, small and new, overlaid on what had been blank space for as long as the map had existed. The patients. Named things were different from unnamed things. Unnamed things were potential, they were gray and open and waiting to become whatever the next person decided to make them. Named things were known. They had histories and edges and meanings that preceded you. The patients had a history that preceded every empire currently drawing breath in the galaxy. She thought about the personal log entry she had written on day 9, in the early morning hours before she had taken her findings to the Admiral. A species does not develop a documented protocol for receiving invasion fleets, unless they have received enough invasion fleets to need one. She had been right. She had been right in the way of someone who has assembled pieces correctly, but not yet seen the picture they made. The picture was this. The humans had not survived 300 years of isolation because they were lucky, or because the galaxy had left them alone, out of goodwill. They had survived because they had understood something about the nature of the galaxy that no other civilization seemed to understand in the same way. Power was not ships. Power was not territory. Power was not the size of your army, or the efficiency of your weapons, or the reach of your political influence. Power was what happened when you outlasted everyone else's certainty. Every empire that had sent a fleet into the patients had been certain of their strength, certain of the weakness on the other side, certain that the warning was for lesser civilizations and not for them. That certainty was the vulnerability. It was the thing that made fleets walk into traps they had been explicitly warned about. It was the thing that made 17 civilizations look at the same gray region on the same map and make the same decision. The humans had been building their defense in the space left by other people's certainty for 300 years. They had furnished the dark with patience, with rock, with machinery that ran without interruption, while the rest of the galaxy forgot they existed. And the rest of the galaxy, being certain of its own power, had not looked carefully at the dark, had not asked what lived in it, had not wondered what 300 years of quiet actually meant. Thessaly, 8, stood at the window for a long time. Then she wrote the last entry in her personal log. She wrote, "The warning was never a warning. It was directions. 38. She thought about that. Then she added one more line. To everyone who ever received it. The directions worked. Just not the way you thought. She closed the log. The window showed her the sky wide and dark and full of named and unnamed things. Things that had been built and things that were waiting and things that had been patient for so long they had become part of the landscape of the galaxy itself. Somewhere out there, in the tunnels and the rock and the deep infrastructure of 3 centuries, Commander Dara Ose Mwangi was probably filing a report, noting the date, updating the record, adding the 17th entry to the list that the 18th would eventually read. The list that said in 17 different ways, this is what happened, this is what they found, this is how it ended. The list that was, itself, the only warning that had ever had a chance of working, because the only warning anyone ever believed was the one written in the language of things that had already happened. The map had a name on it now. The dark had been furnished. The patience had paid off. It always did.